the man behind the myth. And first of all, the main thing to note is that Hawley was a professional soldier. He'd served in numerous conflicts over half a century of soldiering. He was also interested in the theory of warfare as well as its practical nature. His private life is generally little known, but there is nothing there which should earn him censure. However, the information, the best source of information, there's Hawley's own autobiography, there's letters to and from him, which can be found at the National Archives, National Library of Scotland, as well as the Royal Archives, which provide a more authentic account of his life and career, as well as other writing both by him and about him. There's only one full-length study of Hawley, which is this, and I'm about to give a summary of the main points of the book. Henry Hawley was born in January 1685, the son of Francis Hawley and his wife Judith. Francis Hawley was a captain. He'd served in the army under Charles II, he'd served in the Monmouth campaign, switching sides in 1688 to John William of Orange. However, Francis was killed in battle during the 9 Years' War, 1692, but fortunately, William III, as he now was, gave Henry and his two younger brothers commissions in the army. Now, this was not uncommon at the time. It didn't mean that children were actually fighting in battle until they were teenagers, of course. And it wasn't until 1697 that Henry went overseas to see a little bit of camp life at the tail end of the said war. Henry was fortunate enough to be introduced at court, where he found favour with Prince George of Denmark, Queen Anne's husband, and he was briefly a friend of their son, the Duke of Gloucester, heir to the throne, but who died in 1700. The Prince of Denmark and Anne helped to sponsor Hawley's career. Unfortunately, this meant that he was hanging around at court during the War of Spanish Succession, which he certainly didn't want to do. It wasn't until the 1707 campaign in Spain that Henry got his first experience of action. Unfortunately for him, he was involved in a campaign which ended in the defeat at Alamanza in 1707, of which the battle Henry took part. In 1710, he was involved in a duel and killed a man, just as his father had also fought a duel and killed a man too. But fortunately for Henry, he had Queen Anne's blessing and received a pardon. Back in Britain, by 1715, Hawley was a lieutenant colonel in Evans Dragoons, which fought under the Duke of Argyll at the Battle of Sheriffmuir in 1715. Hawley's command was stationed on the right side of the British Army. They came under fire from the Jacobite infantry opposite, and Hawley himself was wounded, along with several of his men. But he did see his regiment, along with other cavalry regiments, defeat the Jacobite left wing at the army and rout them with much slaughter. And it's been said that this experience led him to believe that the Jacobite army was vulnerable to cavalry, although he himself never wrote or said anything in his copious writings about this. He also saw military service in 1719 during the War of the Quadruple Alliance, where he was among the expeditionary force which took part in an attack on the Spanish town of Vigo. For the next 2 years, Hawley and most of the British Army were at peace. There was no active soldiering for most of the army in these decades. And perhaps now we should examine Hawley the man a little. He bought a small country house in a village called Hartley Wintney, which is in Hampshire, not far from Basingstoke. As a cavalryman, perhaps it was natural he should take up hunting, and he joined a prestigious county hunt, which amongst its members included various senior military and political figures, including the Duke of Newcastle and Henry Pelham. On one occasion, the hunt was very lengthy, and it was only Hawley who was able to witness the kill, which is a testament to his horsemanship and his stamina. He also had a beloved dog called Monkey, who on his death in 1734 earned himself a gravestone on Hawley's property, which is more than his master ever did, and Hawley referred to him as the best spaniel that e'er wagged a tail. Hawley was never married. In this he was akin to fellow soldiers such as Wade, Husk, Cope and Cumberland, but he was certainly not a misogynist, and the woman in his life was Elizabeth Toovey, who was a widow with 2 sons. He's not known to have fathered any children with her or anyone else, unlike Field Marshal Wade, but he did take a paternal care over the widow's 2 sons, both of which became officers in the army, and one of them even spent time as Hawley's aide in Scotland and elsewhere. Now, Hawley's exact relationship with Elizabeth can only be deduced by his will, because as well as leaving generous provision for her, he wrote of her that she was for many years my friend and companion, and often my careful nurse, and in my absence my faithful steward. She is a person I think myself bound in honour and gratitude to provide for as well as I can. Now, certainly never wed, as Hawley wrote, "As I never was married, I have no heir." She and her sons were certainly generously taken care of after Hawley's death in 1759, as he left the bulk of his property, chiefly lands in Hartley Wintney, as well as a house to them, as well as making provision as he was to do throughout his career to his spinster sister. His will also provided evidence for his character, and he comes across as being distinctly eccentric by the standards of the 18th century, although perhaps not our own standards. He stated his strong dislike of both lawyers and clergymen. He also showed humility, writing, "My carcass may be put anywhere, it is equal to me, but I will have no more expense or ridiculous show than if a poor soldier, who is as good a man, was to be buried from the hospital." Hawley also spent his time during the long peace thinking about his profession, and certainly 20 years of peace certainly gave him time to do it. Now, the common stereotype raised as a matter of fact in the factually dubious Peter Watkins film Culloden is that the British officer class at the time was anti-intellectual in the extreme. Well, as with much else in that film, this is certainly erroneous, as a recent book about British officers and their books reveals. Among the literate soldiers, we have people like Hawley, we have Humphrey Bland, and earlier Hugh Mackay, all of whom wrote about military matters. Hawley wrote that fellow officers should read both military classics, such as Caesar's, but also modern works by generals such as Marshal de Saxe of France, and also to read about the campaigns of the Spanish succession. He wrote, "When I became to be captain, I began little to think, and being then in service, I had frequent occasion of practice and experience only, was a very slow way to come at science, and began to reflect and study, and to write and consider things that I either had read or heard, and I will set them down in a rough way with thoughts and remarks of their own." Education was seen by Hawley as an ongoing process, as he wrote, "I am of opinion that a man should always be learning." And he thought that Bland's famous book was only of limited use. He wrote of the inadequacies of some officers, men who had been in an infantry regiment and then transferred to a cavalry regiment, or vice versa, needed time and effort to make good. He railed against elderly men who were officers and were inadequate, and wrote against men marrying for love and not to better themselves, and the consequences of the families of soldiers if the soldiers died in service. He also addressed the men in the ranks, outlining advice to a new and ambitious soldier. He made many recommendations about not gambling, saving money, obeying orders, avoiding bad company, reading the articles of war, and how to progress to corporal and sergeant. His regiment had a writing master, and he urged young soldiers to take advantage of learning how to read and write, and how to make accounts and to progress through the ranks. He also wrote about the role of cavalry, and of course Hawley was a cavalry officer. He suggested that green-coated light dragoons armed with carbines be introduced to act as the vanguard of an army on active service. They would use firepower as their principal weapon. Such forces were eventually introduced in the British Army during the 7 Years' War. He also wrote about other cavalry, that regiments of guard cavalry should be equipped with body armour, and that dragoons should have longer swords and iron skull caps beneath their tricorns. However, in his opinion, he wrote, the dragoons in England are certainly the finest troops in the world, and perhaps that's comment is worth remembering in light of the Battle of Falkirk. He also made comments about the infantry, a topic he was less qualified to discuss because of his lack of experience being a foot soldier. He recommended that the wooden ramrod be introduced rather than the steel ones, which were then coming into common usage. He also recommended about the introduction of pikemen among musket-armed battalions on a limited scale, which is also something that Michael Sachs was considering. He believed that infantrymen should not carry swords, and that during peacetime they should be employed in public works like building roads. It's noteworthy that his writings, which are voluminous, also discuss the relationship between the army and the civil state, with references to the danger that could occur under a would-be autocrat, as had appeared in the previous century. Now, this may come as a surprise to those who would align Hawley as being in favour of military authority, as opposed to the Tories and the opposition Whigs, who looked with suspicion among standing armies. It's not known how widespread and well known were Hawley's writings in his lifetime. There's no evidence that they were ever published, so it's probable that they weren't terribly well known. However, they do show an insight into the man himself, who clearly had a cerebral side to his character, and whilst not all his ideas seem sound, especially with the wooden ramrods, others, as regards to cavalry and constitutional liberty, seem reasonable enough. During this period of peace, Colonel Hawley became brigadier and major general, as did many other ranks due to seniority. In 1740, he was 55 years old, and his active service was about to recommence as Britain went to war again. He turned down a command in the West Indies, sensibly enough, and joined the main army in Europe, becoming Lieutenant General and seeing service at Dettingen, 1743, where his role is not known, but afterwards he turned down the honour of a knighthood on the grounds that he thought lots of men were getting knighthood, so it's a very commonplace honour. In 1745, he was left in temporary command of the army, while General Ligonier was briefly recalled to Britain. This meant that Hawley had numerous tasks he had to deal with, including the overseeing of military discipline. And it's from this period that some of his black reputation emerges. The quotation that almost every single writer uses about Hawley is from the pen of Horace Walpole, a most unmilitary observer, who wrote about Hawley. He is called Lord Chief Justice. Frequent and sudden executions are his passion. Last winter, he had an intelligence of a spy coming from the French army. The first notice of the army had of this arrival was of seeing him dangle from a gallows in his muff and boots. One of the surgeons of the army begged the body of a soldier who was hanged for desertion to dissect. Well, said Hawley, but then you shall give me the skeleton to hang up in the guardroom. However, the three known courts-martial in which Hawley was involved have been rarely examined, and these cast a rather different light on Hawley's character. In the first of these, a private got drunk, argued with his sergeant's wife, and then hit the sergeant. While striking a senior soldier is a major military offence, but on the man's officer stressing his previous good character, Hawley pardoned him. On another occasion, 5 soldiers got drunk, stripped a woman, used abusive language towards the sergeant, hit him and resisted the guard when they were to be arrested. Again, these are serious military offences happening during wartime. However, the court-martial only had 3 of the soldiers flogged and 2 acquitted. Then there was an instance of a deserter who went over to the French and then returned to the Allied lines in order to try and enlist soldiers for the French army. A general court-martial was held and came up with a unanimous decision that the man was guilty and should hang. Hawley endorsed the decision, but this was a conventional one. For example, Ligonier once wrote, "I am pretty much determined in my mind never to pardon a deserter. I was never president in my days that I did not speak of it in that light." So Hawley's decisions over military discipline were fairly conventional ones, and certainly weren't the hanging and flogging that Horace Walpole seems to imply. Another couple of instances when Hawley came into condemnation by Walpole are as follows. On arrival in Ghent in 1744, Hawley was offered money by the magistrates in return for favours, and Hawley was enraged, telling them that he was already in receipt of a salary as a general, and was very verbally abusive towards the magistrates, because he considered that his honour had been insulted. Now taking bribes in the 18th century was pretty commonplace. It was seen as the perk of a job. And when the elder William Pitt showed his incorruptibility as Paymaster General, it was thought to be quite unusual and noteworthy. Hawley was also accused of not giving the Prince of Hesse suitable regard. But Hawley saw matters in military, not social terms. And since the Prince was inferior in military rank, although not in social rank, Hawley saw things in that light. The Prince was actually his military inferior. In all this, Hawley may well be deemed eccentric, as he was in his opinion about clergymen and lawyers, but at least he was not corrupt. Hawley was in command of the cavalry at both Dettingen and Fontenoy in 1745. In the latter, he was wounded whilst in command of the rear guard, which was covering the infantry's retreat. Late in the year, he was given a small command to try and relieve the town of Ath, but despite arriving after it had fallen, his forces were able to defeat the French cavalry force on the way. Of course, in 1745, of course, we got the outbreak of the Jacobite insurrection in Scotland. Initially, Hawley was seen as being too useful a man to actually bring him over to Britain, that it would be better for him to be on the continent. But by November, there were comments about his return being essential. The Duke of Richmond writing, "For God's sake, don't think of taking Hawley from us," this is in Britain. "Indeed, he is equal to anybody." And another officer wrote, "Hawley would be invaluable to our army." And this is the army in Britain, of course. Hawley eventually joined Cumberland's command in the Midlands in December, and was put in pursuit of the Jacobite army, but almost as soon as that happened, he was given the job of replacing the elderly Field Marshal George Wade. Now, Wade's army was not in a good state. After weeks of fruitless winter marching, we saw many men in hospital or dead. It had now to fight in Scotland. The artillery and gunners were few, and 2 of the 3 cavalry regiments disgraced themselves at Prestonpans. Money and supplies were scarce. Hawley complained about these, but was determined to do his best, and arrived in Edinburgh in January 1746 with a pressing need to relieve Stirling Castle, which then was the seat of Jacobites, and following the surrender of the town of Stirling earlier that month. Like many British generals, Hawley held the Jacobite army in contempt. "Rascally scum," as he referred to them. Although, as I said, this was in tune with other generals. Cumberland referred to Jacobites as that despicable enemy, and Husk was convinced that the Jacobite army was in a very great panic. Hawley had never exercised independent command in a major battle before, but marched his men towards Falkirk, towards what would be a fateful encounter. Now, this is not the space, obviously, to provide an in-depth account of the battle, but a few points concerning Hawley's conduct in it should be made. The major criticisms of him are that he failed to send out the cavalry as scouts, to ascertain the motions of the Jacobite army, and secondly, ordered the said cavalry to charge the Jacobite line once the army is in close proximity on Falkirk Muir. However, some of the mythology, I think, can be discounted. A Scottish Whig historian, Andrew Henderson, began the myth that Hawley was distracted by Lady Kilmarnock, whose calendar house he was staying in. However, the reality is that he was actually awake by 5 o'clock in the morning of 17th of January, and using a telescope was able to see the approach of the Jacobite army. So had the army, the British army, standing ranks. Hawley had given some thought on how to defeat the Jacobites, as Cumberland was later to do. And that was to rely on the firepower of the infantry, the seasoned regiments who had done so well at Fontenoy and Dettingen, firepower. Hawley wrote, the sure way to demolish them is at 3 deep, to fire by ranks diagonally to the centre where they come. The rear rank first, and even that rank not to fire until they are within 10 or 12 paces. However, this required training and discipline, as close fire against charging troops was unusual in conventional warfare at this time. As I'm sure most of you know, the British cavalry and infantry advanced towards the Jacobite army, with faster moving cavalry being ahead of the infantry. In order to attack the flank of Jacobite right, with this proved impossible. Failure to tempt the Jacobites to fight at long range was also unsuccessful, which meant that a charge could be countered by musketry at short range, which it was, and by Jacobite infantry, which stood firm. The result was that the cavalry lost the melee and galloped away. Hawley was clearly nearby. He tried to rally them, and he later wrote, "Threats and fair words would not do, for they never stopped till they got to camp, which was a good mile distant." And speaking in third person, the Lieutenant General, in trying to stop the dragoons, was beat down, him and his horse, and then twice and both times nearly killed or taken by the Highlanders. He was at last forced along with the rest of the crowd to the bottom of the hill. His attempts to rally his men had failed. And that was virtually the end of the battle for Hawley. Elsewhere, much of the infantry fled, but a few stayed and were killed, but the battalions on the right stood firm to repel the advancing Jacobites. Eventually, Hawley ordered a general retreat from the camp back to Edinburgh. And that evening, he famously wrote, "My heart is broke. We had enough to beat them, but such a scandalous cowardice I never saw." Now, given that there have been instances of cowardice, court-martials began to be held in Edinburgh. Now, as said, the myth is that Hawley was an enthusiastic hanger. And Hawley certainly spoke tough in his letters about the need for hangings, but the result was that only 4 men were hanged, and 3 of these were men who deserted from the British army on the continent, joined the French army, only to be captured at sea en route to Scotland. And the other deserter was a man who joined the Jacobite army from the British army after the Battle of Prestonpans. Given that desertion and joining the enemy army are major military crimes, any other alternative to these 4 hangings would have been unthinkable in wartime. Ligonier had written after the fall of Carlisle, when 4 other deserters who had joined the Jacobites were hanged, he said, "I wish the vermin hanged." And it's worth noting that none of the men from the army who fled, who were guilty of cowardice, were executed, although 2 of them were flogged. Hawley was replaced by Cumberland as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Scotland, but he remained an important secondary commander in the campaign. When the bulk of the army was at Aberdeen, Hawley stayed at the house of Mrs. Gordon, the wife of a Jacobite soldier. Hawley had all her furniture, including china, kitchenware, bed linen, and her husband's clothes, shipped off to Edinburgh, total value of £600. Now, there's no explanation as to why he did this, but presumably he saw it as the legitimate spoils of war from an enemy, although, of course, in legal terms, this is plain robbery. At Culloden, Hawley was in command of the 2 dragoon regiments on the left of the British Army, and he had the Argyle militia make a hole in the walls so the cavalry could pass through and threaten the right flank of the Jacobite army. However, Hawley by this time had learned caution and did not advance his cavalry until the main Jacobite army was in flight. and in it made its contribution to completing the work of infantry and artillery in creating great slaughter to the Jacobite army to complete the British victory. There was another myth at this about Hawley and Culloden, and that is that he ordered Major James Wolfe to shoot a wounded Jacobite, and Wolfe, he refuses. You may have my commission, but you may not have my honour. However, this story does not appear until several decades later, and judging by the writings that we know that Wolfe wrote after the battle, he does not mention the incident, first of all, and secondly, he does not appear to have had any sympathy for the defeated Jacobites either. So I think that's another myth we can cross off. Hawley did not like staying in Scotland to stamp out the embers of Jacobitism that remained. He claimed he had no knowledge of or interest in what he termed politics or civil affairs. But he did suggest a reward given to each soldier, bringing in the head of a Jacobite. But, as with the hangings early in the year, his back was worse than his bite, and this policy never materialised in reality. He did preside, along with other officers, over other court-martials of deserters and officers who had not acted as they should. There's also time for some leisure, with horse races at Fort Augustus, where the horse backed by Hawley managed to win by 4 inches. Back in England in 1746, Hawley penned a memorandum to the customs office as their customs men getting his soldiers drunk and so cheating them out of their share of rewards for capturing smugglers and confiscating contraband. Hawley also intervened on behalf of an old soldier to help him become a member of the garrison of Edinburgh Castle. Now, Hawley could be rough with his men, but no more so than any other officer. He also intervened on their behalf as well. At the Battle of La Felt in the following year, Hawley again demonstrated his courage when he and his two aides seized a banner from a French cavalryman. He and Ligonier led the Allied cavalry in preventing the French cavalry from pursuing the Allied infantry, and although it is the latter who was captured, who usually gets all the credit for this act, Hawley was also involved as well. This was the end of Hawley's practical soldiering, but after the War of Austrian Succession, he sought a sinecure that the governorship of a castle or fort would give him. But initially, after having offered fairly derisory possibilities, he accepted that of the governorship of Portsmouth in 1752, an office he held the rest of his life. In his leisure time, he had paintings of himself commissioned, he penned his autobiography, and his last military work was to draw up plans for the defence of southern England at the onset of the 7 Years' War in 1756. 3 years later, he was dead and was buried without any stone to mark where his mortal remains lay, unlike, for example, Field Marshal George Wade. Now, two contemporary judgments of Hawley are perhaps worth having. One from a civilian, naturally Horace Walpole, and another from a more sympathetic source. Walpole wrote, "He despised money, fame and politics, loved gaming, women and his own favourites, and yet had not one sociable virtue." The Duke of Richmond wrote, "His Royal Highness expressed more regard for you than I think I ever heard him almost for any other military man. Ligonier is my right hand, and next to him my principal reliance is upon Albemarle and Hawley, the first as a foot officer and the second as a horse officer, and Hawley is the first I know in the whole army for leading a line of cavalry." I perhaps ought to mention another anecdote which sometimes gets spread about Hawley, which is another myth, although it's quite well known one. It is sometimes said that Hawley was the illegitimate son of George II. Now, Henry Hawley was born in 1685. George II, as he was not then of course, was born in 1683. So I think most people hopefully can do the maths. But in 2018, I was doing some research for this book at National Records of Scotland, and I mentioned to someone, oh yes, I might have look up General Hawley, and the researcher said to me, oh yes, he was the illegitimate son of George II, wasn't he? But there we are. Anyway, just to sum up, therefore, Hawley was a career soldier from his teens to his 60s. He fought in several conflicts. He displayed bravery in battle. He could be rough with his tongue, but in action only went as far as was conventional. In fact, he could be quite sympathetic towards the common soldier. He was also a thinker and a writer, as well as a man of action. He could also be eccentric in his views on clergy and lawyers, etc. And although he was resistant to bribery, he was not immune to the temptations of theft, as Mrs. Gordon found. As a private man, he was sociable enough with his fellow huntsmen. He was kind towards his sister, and of course his mistress Elizabeth Tuvey, and her sons. As a subordinate, he proved his worth on numerous occasions in battle. But on the one day he commanded in battle, he was defeated. Now this was a blot on his career, is undeniable. Yet it was but one day in a career spanning a little over the first half of the 18th century. It is, therefore, in my opinion, high time that his reputation is reassessed more favourably. Thank you for listening.
We've got a couple of minutes till we have coffee, but are there any questions?